The carriage wheels crunched against the frost-rimed gravel of Grosvenor Square, the rhythmic clop of the horses offering the only counterpoint to the heavy silence that draped over Harrington's townhouse. We were admitted through a side entrance by a constable whose pale face betrayed the lingering shock of the discovery. The air inside was thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and the coppery tang of blood that no amount of scrubbing could entirely dispel. Lestrade awaited us at the foot of the grand staircase, his usual bluster subdued beneath a palpable tension. "The body has been removed to the mortuary," he said quietly as we ascended. The coroner confirms a single thrust upward and slightly to the left, consistent with a right-handed assailant standing directly before him. The letter opener was Lord Harrington's own. Hey, no forced entry, no sign of another. Holmes offered no reply, merely brushing past him to push open the heavy oak doors of the study. The room was precisely as Finch had described, yet stripped of its human tragedy, it resembled a stage set awaiting its next act. I took out my notebook as Holmes began his circuit, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning every surface with the meticulous hunger of a cartographer charting unmarked territory. "Note the position of the reading chair, Watson," he murmured, not turning. "Overturned not by a struggle but as though struck from behind. The leg is fractured cleanly, suggesting a sudden, precise impact rather than a flailing motion. Lord Harrington did not rise to meet his attacker. He was seated, likely engrossed." When the blow came, I sketched the chair's angle and the dark stain on the Persian rug. Yet the door was bolted from within. How does a killer strike and vanish without unfastening it? "A question for later," Holmes replied, kneeling beside the overturned chair. He produced his lens, examining the floorboards with microscopic attention. "Observe the dust. The rug has been disturbed, yes, but beyond its edge, near the wainscoting, the accumulation is undisturbed except for a single, narrow drag mark, not a footstep. Too light? A cord, perhaps, or a thin wire drawn deliberately to avoid displacing the heavier particles." Lestrade frowned. "We found no such mark during the initial sweep." "Because you were looking for boots, Inspector," Holmes said without malice. He stood and moved to the desk. The spilled ink had dried into a jagged constellation across the ledger. Holmes leaned close, his breath fogging slightly in the chill air. "The pattern is curious. It radiates outward from the left edge of the blotter, as though the bottle were knocked from that side, yet Lord Harrington was right-handed and the chair suggests he faced forward. Someone else stood to his left, struck the bottle, but then struck him." I recorded the observation, though its significance remained elusive. "The witness described the gas jet hissing in a draught, yet the valve is shut." Holmes turned to the brass sconce on the wall. He twisted the valve, testing its resistance. "Stiff, recently worked, but observe the glass chimney." He held his lens to it. "A faint smudge of soot concentrated at the base. This fixture was lit, Watson, and extinguished within the last hour. Not 3, as the police log claims. Someone lit it after the murder, then turned it off, likely to simulate a draft or to mask the scent of something else. Paraffin, perhaps, or a chemical agent." He stepped back, his gaze drifting to the grandfather clock in the corner. Its brass pendulum hung motionless, the hands frozen at 11 o'clock precisely. The clock was wound, yet it has stopped. Not from neglect, but from a deliberate strike. The weight is dislodged. Why halt time at the exact moment of death? "To corroborate the witness's account," I suggested. "Precisely," Holmes said softly. "Which brings us back to Miss Vance. She did not see the future, Watson. She was fed a script. The inconsistencies in her statement, the hissing gas, the shouted word, meridian, were not errors. They were deliberate flaws, planted to make her appear hysterical, to ensure the police would doubt her sanity while simultaneously accepting the core facts of the scene. A psychological sleight of hand. Someone wanted the murder to appear foretold, but not perfectly so, just credible enough to divert attention from the mechanics of the locked room. He turned to the fireplace, running a gloved finger along the cold grate. The true crime did not happen in a moment of passion. It was engineered, and the engineer left behind a single, stubborn clue that the witness's script could not account for. He withdrew his finger, revealing a fine, silvery powder clinging to the leather. Meridian, Watson, not a word. A compound. Mercuric chloride. Used in photography, in medicine, and, more pertinently, in the preservation of certain rare documents. Our killer did not merely strike. He left a calling card in the dust of this grate. And I suspect it will lead us not to a ghost, but to a very tangible ledger of secrets. I closed my notebook, the weight of his words settling over me. The fog outside seemed to press closer against the windows, but within the study the pieces were beginning to align. Holmes's mind had already crossed the threshold of the impossible, stepping firmly into the realm of the calculated. I could only follow, pen in hand, and trust that the logic would hold. We left the townhouse as the church bells of St. George's tolled the quarter hour, the heavy oak doors sealing the study's silence behind us. Holmes moved with brisk purpose down the gravel path, his collar turned against the biting damp, while I followed at a pace dictated by the uneven cobblestones and the lingering chill of the crime scene. Lestrade had ordered a carriage to stand by, its lamps casting pale, wavering circles in the fog, but Holmes waved it away with a curt gesture. Bow Street is scarcely a mile, and the cold will keep our minds sharp. I require the walk. We set off in silence, our footsteps echoing in the deserted square, the rhythmic tap of Holmes's cane marking time like a metronome. Miss Clara Vance was being held in a cramped anteroom adjacent to the inspector's office, a space normally reserved for lodging petty thieves and drunken disorderlies. She sat upon a wooden bench, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap, with the rigid stillness of a woman bracing for a verdict. Yet as Holmes stepped into the lamplight, her eyes lifted, and I saw not the vacant hysteria Lestrade had described, but a sharp, exhausted intelligence. He took a seat opposite her, removing his gloves and placing them neatly beside his notebook. His manner was not that of an interrogator, but of a physician assessing a delicate instrument. "You are not mad, Miss Vance," Holmes began quietly. "Nor are you a fraud. You have merely been given a mirror and told to look into it. Tell me precisely how the vision arrived." She swallowed, her voice trembling, but clear. "It came as a pressure behind my eyes, Mr. Holmes, like a sudden descent into cold water. I saw the desk, the ledger, the knife. I heard the clock strike, though the face was turned away from me. I felt the draft, and I knew, with terrible certainty, that a man was dying." I ran to the nearest station before I could think to doubt it. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her hands. "You speak with the clarity of an eyewitness, yet your pupils are dilated and your breathing remains shallow. You have recently worked with silver nitrate or a similar developing agent. The faint yellowing at your cuticles, the slight tremor in your left thumb, the persistent scent of acetic acid clinging to your sleeve, these are the marks of a dark room, not a drawing room. You are a photographer, or you were." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly masked by fatigue. "I assisted a commercial studio in Bloomsbury for 3 years, until last month when the proprietor dismissed me without notice." Holmes leaned forward. "And the proprietor's name?" "Mr. Elias Vance, no relation." A man of considerable discretion and few scruples. The inspector's door opened then, and Lestrade entered, his boots heavy, a folded dossier in his hand. His expression had hardened into the familiar mask of bureaucratic triumph. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have a name. Julian Croft, Lord Harrington's nephew, known for heavy gambling at White's. Owes nearly £4,000 to a known moneylender. A footman at the club swears Croft was seen near Grosvenor Square at 10 o'clock, and his coat bears a torn lining consistent with a hurried struggle. We have a warrant ready." Watson felt the familiar pull of narrative satisfaction. The motive, the opportunity, the physical evidence, it aligned with mechanical precision. Lestrade had his man. The case, it seemed, was already slipping into the tidy compartments of justice. Yet Holmes did not smile. He merely tapped a single finger against his notebook, his eyes drifting to the ceiling, as though listening to a distant frequency. "A torn lining," he repeated softly. "Convenient. And the gambling debts, how conveniently documented. You will find Croft, Inspector, precisely where you expect him, but do not expect the truth to accompany him." Lestrade bristled. "The evidence is solid, Holmes. We'll have him in a cell by morning." "By all means," Holmes replied, rising and smoothing his coat. "But leave the questioning to your subordinates. Croft is a blunt instrument, and blunt instruments break when pressed too hard. Watson, we must visit Bloomsbury at first light. I require a tour of Mr. Elias Vance's studio, and you, Miss Vance, we will remain under guard, but you will not be charged. Or the law may demand a culprit, but it does not yet have one." As we stepped back into the pre-dawn gloom, the fog had thinned to a silver haze. Holmes walked in silence, his hands buried deep in his pockets. I knew from the set of his jaw and the quiet intensity of his breathing that he had already unravelled the thread Lestrade was so eagerly pulling. He said nothing of the mercuric chloride, the stopped clock, or the deliberate staging of the witness's account. He kept the true shape of the deception folded within himself, waiting for the right moment to unfold it. I followed, my notebook heavy with unanswered questions, as London stirred around us, oblivious to the quiet war of logic already underway. The dawn broke in pale, watery streaks as our hired cab rattled down Gray's Inn Road, the iron-rimmed wheels striking a steady rhythm against the damp cobbles. London was stirring beneath a sky the colour of bruised slate, and the chill of early November seeped through the carriage windows, carrying with it the familiar scent of coal smoke and wet wool. Holmes sat motionless against the velvet seat, his gaze fixed upon the passing brickwork, though I knew his mind was already weighing the chemical residue he had carefully sealed in a glass vial. When we alighted on a narrow Bloomsbury street lined with soot-stained warehouses and modest boarding-houses, Holmes did not hesitate. He strode toward a recessed doorway marked only by a tarnished brass plate, E. Vance, daguerreotype, and collodion portraits. The lock yielded to a deft twist of his pick, and we slipped inside before the morning watchman completed his round. But the interior smelled sharply of ozone, ether, and the metallic tang of fixing baths. Weak sunlight filtered through high, dust-choked windows, illuminating rows of wooden shelves laden with glass plates, amber chemical jars, and coiled lengths of velvet backdrop. A heavy iron stove dominated one corner, its flue blackened by years of collodion fumes. Holmes moved through the space with silent efficiency, his cane tapping lightly against the floorboards. He paused at a workbench where a developing tray sat half-filled with crystallized hypo, its edges curling like frost. "Elias Vance did not merely take portraits, Watson," he murmured, lifting a ledger bound in cracked leather. "He practiced the art of preservation. And preservation, as we know, or is often a matter of arresting decay before it can reveal what lies beneath. He drew aside a heavy baize curtain, revealing the dark room. Red glass panes cast the cramped space in a bloody gloom. Holmes lit a match, shielding it with his palm, and examined the walls. Chemical stains mapped the plaster in abstract patterns, but it was a series of brass hooks along the far wall that arrested his attention. "Note the spacing," he said, tracing the iron rings with his gloved finger. "Designed to suspend heavy plates, yes, but also to hold a suspended counterweight, a simple pulley system, easily dismantled and reassembled." He knelt beside a copper sink, scraping at a dried residue with his thumbnail. "Mercuric chloride, used to intensify negatives but also to treat paper or wood for chemical reactions. Our killer did not merely leave it as a calling card, he used it to coat a surface, likely to render it temporarily inert until heat or moisture triggered its action. I opened my notebook, the implications slowly coalescing. "You believe the locked room was engineered from within? A chemical or mechanical device, perhaps wound before the killer left, that struck the victim at the appointed hour?" "More elegant than that," Holmes replied, rising and brushing dust from his sleeves. "The device did not need to strike, it needed only to appear to have struck. Consider the ink spill, the overturned chair, the stopped clock. All are theatrical props arranged to corroborate a narrative fed to Miss Vance. But how does one arrange a murder scene from outside a bolted door? One does not. One arranges it before the door is ever sealed. Either true crime occurred earlier, Watson. Harrington was likely paralyzed by a fast-acting alkaloid administered during his evening correspondence. The killer was never in the room at 11. The letter opener was driven upward by a falling brass weight, triggered by a melting wax seal or a dissolving sugar thread. The locked room was not a puzzle of entry and exit. It was a puzzle of timing. He turned to a locked cabinet near the dark room door. With a series of precise taps and a slender wire, the lock yielded. Inside lay not photographic supplies, but a stack of finely drafted architectural schematics, each annotated with precise measurements. The top sheet depicted the exact floor plan of Harrington's study. Holmes traced a line with his finger. The pulley system, the ink bottle, the chair's fulcrum point, all calculated. And here, he lifted a small sealed vial from a velvet-lined compartment. A concentrated solution, administered in brandy, perhaps, or on the edge of a letter. The victim's final moments were not spent in struggle. They were spent in a gradual, paralytic stillness, while the mechanism above him wound down to its inevitable conclusion. Before I could process the full gravity of his deduction, a sharp knock echoed against the street door. Holmes extinguished the match instantly, plunging us into shadow. Through the frosted glass, a silhouette lingered, then retreated. Holmes slipped the vial and the schematics into his coat, his expression hardening into something I rarely saw. Urgency. "We are not alone, Watson," he whispered, "and our host has returned to collect what we have disturbed. The puzzle is larger than a single murder." It is a ledger, and we have just turned the first page." He drew the door open a fraction, peering into the alley. "Come, we must reach Baker Street before the fog swallows us entirely. The game is no longer confined to Grosvenor Square. It has begun to move." We slipped through the narrow mews just as the street door groaned open behind us, the heavy tread of unfamiliar boots echoing against the damp brick. Holmes moved with the silent, practiced grace of a man accustomed to navigating London's hidden arteries, leading me through a labyrinth of alleys and courtyard passages until the familiar facade of 221B emerged from the thinning morning fog. Mrs. Hudson, startled by our sudden and dishevelled arrival, was swiftly dispatched to secure the landing and prepare the silver service for tea. Holmes, however, allowed no delay. He locked the study door, drew the heavy velvet blinds against the pale daylight, and laid the stolen schematics and the glass vial upon the low table with the focused reverence of a scholar unearthing a fragile manuscript. "Observe, Watson," he began, unrolling the architectural drafts and pinning them flat with a series of brass paperweights. "These are not mere floor plans, they are stage directions. Every measurement corresponds precisely to the Harrington study, yet notice the annotations in the margins. Meridian line, thermal trigger, viscosity threshold. Our architect of deception did not rely on crude mechanics alone. He engineered a system that required a specific environmental condition to activate. He lifted the glass vial to the gaslight. The liquid within was nearly clear, with a faint opalescent swirl catching the flame. Mercuric chloride, yes, but compounded with a volatile ether. When exposed to the heat of a lit gas jet, the solution would expand, pushing against a sealed cap until it ruptured, releasing a measured counterweight. The gas was lit not to simulate a draft, but to serve as the ignition. The murder was timed not by the clock, but by the temperature of the room. Watson leaned closer, tracing the precise lines of the diagram. Then Miss Vance's vision was no spontaneous premonition. Someone administered a substance that induced a vivid, suggestible state, perhaps while she worked in the darkroom. The chemical fumes, the isolation, the physical exhaustion, it left her susceptible. She was given a script, told to run to the police. "I am made to believe she had witnessed tomorrow." "Precisely," Holmes replied, his voice tight with focused intensity. "A brilliant psychological stratagem. By making her appear hysterical, the true culprit ensured the Yard would fixate on the supernatural rather than the mechanical. And by feeding her details that were almost, but not entirely, accurate, they created just enough doubt to discredit her without invalidating the core narrative. The inconsistencies were not mistakes. They were pressure valves designed to keep the police investigation flowing toward a predetermined conclusion." He paused, tapping the diagram near the study's wainscoting. "But here lies the flaw in their design. The schematics bear a watermark, not of a commercial drafting firm, but of the Harrington family crest, subtly embossed in the corner. This was not stolen, it was commissioned, and the commissioner was someone who had unrestricted access to Lord Harrington's private quarters long before the night of his death." Before Watson could respond, a sharp rap sounded at the study door. Mrs. Hudson's voice, uncharacteristically strained, announced a visitor, Mr. Alistair Finch. Holmes's eyes narrowed, but he gave a curt nod of admission. Finch entered, his usual composure shattered, his coat damp with fog, a sealed envelope clutched tightly in his hand. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes," he stammered, "but I have just received this. It was delivered to my chambers an hour ago. It contains a confession, dated yesterday, signed by Julian Croft." He laid the envelope on the table, his fingers trembling. "It details the murder. It explains the locked door." It even mentions the gas jet, but Mr. Holmes, Julian Croft has been in France for 3 weeks. I have the ticket receipts and the hotel ledger to prove it." Holmes did not touch the envelope. He merely studied Finch's face, then the wax seal, then the precise alignment of the text through the thin paper. A confession written by a man who was not in London, penned in a hand that mimics Croft's with mechanical precision, and delivered by a courier who knew exactly when to arrive. He smiled, a cold, mirthless curve of the lips. "Our architect is not merely covering his tracks, Watson. He is paving a highway straight to Baker Street. He wants us to see the confession. He wants us to doubt the mechanical theory and embrace the convenient narrative." Why, but a man whose eyes understands thermal triggers and chemical viscosity does not leave his masterpieces unsigned. Holmes stood, reaching for his Inverness once more. We shall not open this letter. Instead, we shall follow the thread it was spun from. Finch, you will return to your chambers and act as though you have delivered the evidence to Lestrade. You will mention nothing of our visit. Watson, fetch your service revolver. The fog has lifted, and the real culprit has just shown us exactly where to look. The heavy study door clicked shut behind Finch, sealing away his nervous footsteps. Holmes did not wait. He crossed the room in 3 swift strides, retrieved his bowler hat from the peg, and slipped a slender leather satchel into his coat. "The city, Watson," he instructed, his voice carrying the crisp certainty of a compass needle finding north. "We must visit a paper merchant on Crane Court before the morning ledgers are sealed. That watermark was not a flourish, it was a ledger mark, and merchants remember their commissions long before solicitors remember their clients." We descended the 17 steps into the damp morning, where a hansom cab already idled at the curb, its driver dozing beneath a woolen scarf. Holmes gave the direction without preamble, and we rattled away from Baker Street, the rhythmic clatter of hooves marking our passage through streets still shaking off the night's chill. Watson watched his companion's profile in the carriage's dim light. Holmes's eyes were closed, but his fingers tapped a steady, unconscious rhythm against his knee, tracing the architecture of a theory already taking shape in his mind. Crane Court was a narrow lane wedged between the Inns of Court and the commercial wharves, its brickwork stained by decades of coal smoke and river damp. Holmes led Watson to a modest shopfront bearing a faded sign, A. Pendleton and Son, archival papers, legal folios, and drafting stock. The bell above the door chimed sharply as they entered, disturbing a cloud of suspended dust that settled slowly onto shelves of neatly stacked paper, brass compasses, and leather-bound registers. Behind a high mahogany counter stood an elderly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a posture bowed from years of poring over fine print. Holmes approached with practiced courtesy, placing a single sovereign on the counter. "Good morning. I require a consultation regarding a recent commission, drafting paper, heavy weight, bearing the Harrington crest watermark, ordered within the fortnight." The merchant's eyes flickered, a subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth. He opened a ledger, his pen hovering. "Such commissions are private, sir. Client discretion is the foundation of this trade." "Discretion is a virtue," Holmes replied softly, "but negligence is a liability. The paper in question was used to draft a mechanical schematic of exceptional precision. The fibers show a high rag content, consistent with your premium stock. Yet the batch mark on the lower corner indicates it was cut from roll number 4, which your supplier's manifest shows was delivered only to 3 establishments in London last month. Yours is the only one within walking distance of a photographic darkroom, a solicitor's office, and a private engineering workshop. I'm not asking for names, Mr. Pendleton. I'm asking for the date of requisition, the quantity, and the method of delivery. The sovereign remains yours either way, but silence will cost you your license." The merchant's pen scratched quickly across the page. He slid the ledger forward. "Ordered 10 days ago, 12 sheets, delivered by private hand, paid in full, no signature provided, only an instruction, for the Meridian project." The courier wore a clerk's frock coat, but his boots were reinforced with steel caps, and his right hand bore a distinctive callus across the knuckles. A machinist, not a solicitor. Holmes absorbed the information, his gaze lingering on the merchant's hands as he closed the ledger. "Thank you. You have been most precise." He turned to leave, but paused at the threshold, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Watson, noting the shift, followed him out into the pale sunlight. "You withheld a question," Watson observed as they walked briskly back toward the main thoroughfare. The merchant's left thumb. It carried a faint metallic stain, silver nitrate, the same compound found on Miss Vance's cuticles. Holmes's pace did not falter. Precisely, which means our stationer is not merely a passive supplier. He is part of the distribution chain. Yet I shall not press him further today. The stain confirms a link, but pressing it prematurely will only drive the network underground. The confession from Croft, the forged schematics, the chemical triggers, they are all threads woven by the same hand, but a hand that understands thermal expansion and psychological suggestion does not work in isolation. It requires funding, and funding, Watson, leaves a paper trail far more revealing than wax seals or whispered visions. He checked his pocket watch, snapping it shut with a decisive click. Lestrade will be preparing to arrest Croft's French associates by noon. We shall let him chase ghosts. Our course lies elsewhere. There is a private workshop near the docks, registered to a shell corporation, known for funding theatrical rigging and industrial patents. If our architect required a space to test his mechanisms without scrutiny, he would not build it in Bloomsbury. And he would build it where the noise of industry masks the sound of gears. Watson felt the familiar tension coil in his chest. The fog had fully lifted, but a colder, more deliberate mist seemed to settle over the investigation. Holmes walked ahead, his silhouette sharp against the morning light, already piecing together a puzzle that stretched far beyond a single locked room. Watson adjusted his coat, checked the weight of his revolver, and followed, knowing the next hour would either confirm the theory or shatter it entirely. The carriage rattled down Wapping High Street, the rhythmic clang of shipyard hammers and the brine-heavy air marking our steady approach to the Thames. Holmes sat rigidly forward, his eyes fixed upon the soot-stained warehouses and tangled rigging of the dockside. The morning fog had burned away to a pale, metallic haze, but the alleys between the wharves remained shrouded in shadow, pooling in the hollows of cracked cobblestone and discarded cargo crates. He directed the cabman to halt 100 yards from a corrugated iron yard bearing a faded, rain-streaked sign, Meridian Engineering and Stagecraft Limited. The name alone confirmed the connection. Holmes dismissed the cab with a few silver coins, his gaze already sweeping the perimeter with the quiet intensity of a surveyor mapping hostile terrain. "Note the ventilation shaft, Watson," he murmured, pointing to a narrow flue rising from the roof. "Stained with copper sulfate residue. They are testing electrical triggers, and the ground floor windows are boarded with fresh pine nailed from the outside. A workshop in retreat, or a laboratory in concealment." We approached through a narrow service passage, Holmes moving with the silent certainty of a man navigating familiar ground. A heavy padlock secured the rear door, but the surrounding timber showed recent splintering and a faint smear of machine oil. Holmes produced a slender tension wrench and a pick, working the mechanism with deft, economical motions until the shackle yielded with a soft, satisfying click. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone, hot brass, and linseed oil. Workbenches lined the walls, cluttered with spools of insulated wire, glass beakers, and precisely machined brass components. At the center stood a heavy wooden armature, draped in a thick canvas tarp. Holmes approached it, his hands moving swiftly beneath the fabric. I kept my revolver drawn but held low, to watching as the tarp fell away to reveal a scaled, meticulously constructed replica of Lord Harrington's study. "A full-scale prototype," Holmes breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. The model featured a miniature desk, a tiny grandfather clock, and a brass counterweight suspended above a wooden mannequin's chest. A thin glass ampoule, identical in design to the vial we had secured from Bloomsbury, sat precisely aligned with a miniature gas valve. Holmes traced a copper wire running from a small galvanic battery to a wax-sealed trigger mechanism. "The ether expands when heated, Watson. It pushes against a plunger, releasing the weight. The letter opener descends along a guided track, striking upward with calculated force." The clock's escapement was deliberately jammed to stop at the moment of impact. Yes, it is not merely a murder weapon, it is an automaton of death designed to operate entirely on schedule. He opened a leather-bound ledger resting on a nearby stool. The pages were filled with meticulous calculations, viscosity coefficients, thermal expansion rates, and delivery times for chemical reagents. At the bottom of the final entry, a single name was recorded in neat, angular script, a Finch. I stepped closer, my breath catching in the damp air. Finch, Lord Harrington's own solicitor, but he was the one who brought the case to you. He claimed total ignorance. Holmes's eyes darkened. Precisely. He did not bring it to us to solve it. He brought it to us to control it. By presenting the mystery himself, he ensured Scotland Yard would look upward toward the supernatural rather than downward at the mechanism. But he needed the police to validate Miss Vance's account, to cement the narrative of a foretold crime, while he quietly dismantled the apparatus after the fact. The forged confession, the convenient nephew, the staged inconsistencies, all were calculated misdirections woven by a man who understood both human psychology and mechanical precision. A sharp scrape echoed from the upper gallery. Holmes's head snapped up. "We are not alone." Heavy boots descended the iron staircase, accompanied by the metallic click of a revolver being cocked. A voice, calm and deeply familiar, called out from the shadows. "I trust the ledger proves instructive, Mr. Holmes, though I must confess, I expected you to arrive an hour sooner." Finch stepped into the dim light, his frock coat immaculate, his silver-tipped cane resting lightly against his shoulder. And behind him stood two men in dockworkers' caps, their postures rigid, hands concealed beneath heavy woolen coats. "You see," Finch continued, his tone carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had long since abandoned hesitation. "Lord Harrington was not merely a peer of the realm. He was the silent partner in a syndicate that controlled 3 major railway contracts. His sudden moral awakening threatened to unravel years of careful arrangements. The mechanism was not born of malice, Mr. Holmes. It was born of necessity. And Miss Vance's vision was merely the spark required to ignite a perfectly contained fire." Holmes did not move. His hands remained at his sides, but his posture shifted into that familiar, coiled readiness. "Necessity, Mr. Finch, is a convenient word for cowardice. You engineered a murder to protect your ledgers, but you forgot one variable." Finch's smile faltered slightly. "Which is?" Holmes's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Time does not forget, and neither do I." The air in the workshop grew thick, charged with the silent promise of violence. I rested my thumb against the hammer of my revolver, my eyes locked on the figures emerging from the gloom. The game had reached its critical juncture, and the next move would decide everything. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant groan of a ship's halyard against a mast and the faint, rhythmic hiss of the workshop's gas lamps. Finch's men did not raise their weapons, but their hands remained concealed beneath their coats, their weight balanced on the balls of their feet. Holmes, however, made no move toward his cane or his coat. He merely stepped forward, to his eyes fixed on the brass counterweight suspended above the wooden mannequin's chest. "You speak of necessity, Mr. Finch," he said, his voice calm and measured. Yet you overlook the most fundamental law of engineering. Precision requires predictability. Your thermal trigger is elegant, but fatally flawed. The dockyard air is heavy with sulfur dioxide from the coal fires and the tidal damp. It reacts with the mercuric chloride coating, accelerating its crystallization. By 10 o'clock, your wax seal would have hardened prematurely. The plunger would never have released. Finch's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A minor variable, easily compensated. Not easily, Holmes countered, turning to face him. Which is why you were in the room. The drag mark near the wainscoting was not a test cord. It was the hem of your own coat. I caught against the floorboard as you manually disengaged the safety pin when the trigger jammed. The spilled ink was not knocked by a falling weight. It was struck by your cane in your haste to reset the mechanism, and the stopped clock was not halted by the device's impact. You struck it yourself with the silver handle of your letter opener to ensure the hands matched Miss Vance's account. You did not merely design the murder, Mr. Finch, you completed it by hand when your masterpiece failed. A muscle twitched in Finch's cheek. The two men behind him shifted, their boots scraping against the concrete. A compelling theory, Mr. Holmes, but theories do not stop bullets. True, Holmes replied smoothly, but chemistry does. With a fluid motion, he withdrew a second glass vial from his inner pocket and hurled it not at the men, but at the iron stove's glowing grate. The glass shattered instantly. A sharp, chemical hiss filled the room as a prepared mixture of ammonium chloride and concentrated acetic acid met the intense heat, flashing into a dense, opaque white vapor that rolled across the floorboards like a sudden tide. The gas lamp sputtered, choked by the sudden displacement of oxygen, plunging the workshop into a dim, swirling twilight. "Watson, left flank!" Holmes commanded, his voice cutting cleanly through the haze. I did not hesitate. I fired a single warning shot into the ceiling, the sharp crack echoing like a rifle report, and lunged toward the silhouette nearest the workbench. My shoulder connected with solid muscle, and we went down in a tangle of limbs and dropped woolen coats. Holmes moved with terrifying efficiency in the gloom, his cane striking the wrist of the second man with a precise, economical crack, sending the revolver clattering across the floor. The vapor, though blinding, was harmless, a calculated diversion measured exactly to the room's volume and the ventilation shaft's draft. Within moments, the two men were disarmed and pinned against the iron supports. Holmes stood over Finch, who had backed against the prototype's armature, his silver-tipped cane raised but trembling. The fog in the room began to thin as the vapor found its way through the upper flue. "You see," Holmes said, adjusting his cuffs with deliberate calm, "I did not come to Baker Street to draft warrants. I came to ensure you would confess exactly as you just did. Lestrade and his men have been stationed at the rear exit since 9 o'clock. They heard the warning shot, but I required more than an arrest. I required the ledger. The railway syndicate's accounts are not kept in a bank, Mr. Finch. They are kept in a hollowed floorboard beneath your own desk at Crane Court. Miss Vance's former employer, Pendleton, has already confirmed the delivery route. You will take us there. Now." Finch's composure finally shattered. The cane fell from his grip, striking the floor with a hollow thud. He looked from the disarmed men to Holmes's unyielding gaze, and the weight of his own meticulous planning collapsed upon him. "The floorboard," he whispered, his voice stripped of all its earlier authority. "It is beneath the green velvet rug. The combination is Harrington's birthday." Holmes nodded, a faint, grim satisfaction touching his lips. Predictable. Even in treason, men cling to sentiment. He turned to me, with his eyes already calculating the next step. Come, Watson, the mechanism is broken, but the ledger remains, and tonight we shall see precisely how much a man is willing to burn to keep his secrets. The heavy iron door of the workshop groaned shut behind us as Lestrade's men secured Finch and his associates in manacles. The inspector's face, usually flushed with bureaucratic triumph, was pale with a mixture of awe and profound discomfort. He had expected a common thug or a disgruntled heir, not a solicitor who had turned murder into a mathematical equation. Holmes offered him only a brief, curt nod, declining to linger over the arrest. "The ledger, Inspector, not the confessions," he said quietly. "Secure the premises, catalogue the prototype, but do not touch the galvanic battery until the constables have ventilated the room. Now the residual ether is highly volatile." Without waiting for a reply, he stepped into the pale morning light, his stride already adjusted to the longer road ahead. We hailed a passing hansom near the docks, the carriage wheels splashing through puddles of oil and rainwater as we turned toward the Inns of Court. The air inside the cab was thick with damp wool and coal smoke, but Holmes seemed entirely insulated from it. He sat with his eyes closed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, tracing the invisible architecture of the case. "You see now, Watson," he began, his voice low and measured, "how the supernatural is merely the mechanical misunderstood. Miss Vance's vision was no gift of prophecy. It was the result of a carefully administered tincture of belladonna and digitalis, likely slipped into her evening tea by a sympathetic neighbour acting on Finch's instructions. The chemical cocktail induces vivid, suggestible hallucinations accompanied by temporal disorientation. Finch fed her the script during her delirium, knowing precisely how her agitated mind would reconstruct it as memory. By the time she reached Bow Street, the narrative was already fixed in her consciousness. The Yard, eager for a sensational resolution, accepted it as truth. I listened, the pieces clicking into place with quiet inevitability. And the locked room? The stopped clock? The hissing gas? "Theatrical props, as I said," Holmes replied. "The clock was jammed to validate her account. The gas was lit to trigger the thermal mechanism, and when it failed to expand sufficiently in the damp air, Finch entered through the servants' passage, a route known only to the household staff, and manually completed the strike. The torn coat lining found on Croft's garment was planted by Finch's own valet, who has been quietly managing the syndicate's London operations for 3 years. Every inconsistency was a deliberate breadcrumb designed to lead the police away from the financial ledger and toward a narrative of inherited guilt and occult foresight. A brilliant diversion had it not relied on the fundamental arrogance of its architect. He believed the police would never look past the spectacle. The carriage halted before the modest townhouse on Crane Court. Holmes paid the driver and ascended the steps with unhurried certainty. Finch's clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained cuffs, attempted to bar our entry, but a single glance from Holmes dissolved his resolve. We were shown directly to the solicitor's private office, a room of heavy mahogany and leather-bound volumes, smelling faintly of beeswax and old paper. Holmes moved to the corner, where a worn green velvet rug lay flat against the oak floorboards. He knelt, brushing aside the fringe to reveal a brass-bound compartment set into the wood. "Harrington's birthday," Holmes murmured, his fingers working the dial with precise, economical turns. The lock yielded with a soft click. He lifted the false panel, revealing a narrow cavity. Within lay a single, thick ledger bound in cracked calfskin, its pages swollen with decades of careful accounting. Holmes opened it to the first entry, his eyes scanning the columns of figures, coded initials, and railway contractor references. His expression hardened into something cold and resolute. "It is all here, Watson. The Meridian Syndicate, Bribes to surveyors, forged land deeds, the systematic extortion of parliamentary votes. Harrington had begun to audit the accounts. His sudden moral awakening was not a crisis of conscience, it was a crisis of liquidity. Finch did not murder a peer, he murdered a liability. He closed the ledger with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The mechanism was merely the final instrument. The true crime was woven into the fabric of this city's commerce, hidden behind legal stationery and whispered promises. Lestrade will have his arrests. Parliament will have its scandal. But the game, as it always does, concludes not with a shout, but with a ledger. He stood, tucking the volume securely beneath his arm, his gaze already turning toward the door. "Come, Watson, the pieces are assembled. It is time to show the world how the illusion was spun." We departed Crane Court as the noon bells began to toll across the city, the heavy ledger secured beneath Holmes's coat like a sealed verdict. The morning's fog had burned away entirely, replaced by a crisp, iron-grey sky that lent the thoroughfares an air of sober clarity. Holmes hailed a passing cab without hesitation, instructing the driver to make for Bow Street. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against wet cobblestone provided a steady backdrop to his quiet meditation. He did not speak until we had passed the Royal Exchange, his gaze fixed on the passing architecture as though reading the city's secrets in its brick and mortar. "The ledger will unravel the syndicate, Watson," he murmured at last. "Oh dear, but it will not mend the mind it fractured. Miss Vance's hallucinations, however chemically induced, leave psychological scars that no court verdict can erase. We shall visit her before the day concludes. A truth delivered without compassion is merely another form of cruelty." I nodded, though my own thoughts were occupied by the sheer audacity of Finch's design. The mechanical precision of the murder, the psychological manipulation of the witness, the financial corruption hidden beneath legal stationery, it was a conspiracy that had operated in plain sight, shielded by the very institutions meant to uncover it. Holmes's methods had peeled back each layer with surgical detachment, yet I could not help but feel the lingering weight of what had been lost. Lord Harrington's life traded for railway contracts. A young woman's sanity is sacrificed to orchestrate a perfect alibi. The machinery of justice was finally turning, but it moved with the cold indifference of a clockwork mechanism. At Bow Street we were met by a flustered Lestrade, who had clearly spent the morning wrestling with warrants and jurisdictional disputes. His eyes widened when Holmes placed the ledger upon his desk, its cracked calfskin cover speaking louder than any testimony. "I shall require every man we can spare," Lestrade said, his voice stripped of its usual bluster. "The railway board, the parliamentary clerks, the surveyors, they'll all need questioning. Finch's associates will scatter like rats the moment the press catches wind of this." Holmes offered a thin smile. "They will not scatter, Inspector. They are bound by ledgers, and ledgers bind men far more securely than iron bars. I'll provide the warrants. I shall ensure the narrative is presented without sensationalism. The public need not know of the thermal trigger or the belladonna tincture. Let them believe the murder was committed by a man with a letter opener and a guilty conscience. The truth is sufficient for the courts." We left the station as the afternoon light began to soften, casting long, amber shadows across the pavement. Our next destination was a modest boarding house in Bloomsbury, where Miss Vance sat by a small window, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. When Holmes entered, she did not startle. She merely watched him with the quiet exhaustion of a woman who had finally slept after a long fever. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "they tell me I am not to be charged, that my account was manufactured." "It was. Or Miss Vance," Holmes replied, taking a seat opposite her. His tone was uncharacteristically gentle, devoid of its usual sharp edges. You were administered a compound designed to induce vivid, suggestible states. The details you reported were fed to you during your delirium, then reconstructed by your own mind as memory. You are not a prophet, nor a fraud. You are a victim of a man who believed he could engineer certainty. The chemical will leave your system. The fear will fade. What remains is your own name, which you may reclaim without shame. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, but her shoulders relaxed, as though a physical weight had been lifted from them. I turned away, giving her the privacy of her quiet relief, and found Holmes already at the door. The return to Baker Street was made in silence, the city's evening hum rising around us like a tide. When we finally crossed the threshold of 221B, Holmes removed his coat and placed the ledger upon the mantelpiece, where it rested beside his monographs and tobacco boxes, like an artifact from a foreign land. He lit his pipe, the familiar aroma of shag tobacco filling the room, and sank into his armchair. The fire crackled in the grate, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. I poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to him before taking my seat. The case was concluded, yet the quiet in the room felt heavier than any mystery. "You have dismantled a syndicate, Holmes," I said at last. "But I cannot help but wonder if the true crime was ever the murder at all. It was the arrogance of a man who believed he could bend time, chemistry, air, and human memory to his will." Holmes exhaled a slow plume of smoke, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Arrogance, Watson, is merely intelligence without humility." Finch understood mechanics, but he forgot that men are not gears. They break, they remember, they resist. And in that resistance, the truth always finds its way to the surface. He leaned forward, tapping the glass of his brandy. "The ledger will see him hanged. The syndicate will dissolve, but London will build another. It always does. Our work is never to stop the tide, but to ensure the water does not drown the innocent." I nodded, raising my glass in silent acknowledgement. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm, unaware of the quiet war that had just been won within our walls. Yet as I watched Holmes's sharp profile in the firelight, and I knew the game would never truly end. There would always be another fog, another locked room, another mind willing to test the boundaries of reason. And there would always be a man ready to meet it with nothing but logic, a keen eye, and an unyielding devotion to the truth. The brandy glasses rested upon the low table, their contents barely disturbed, as the grandfather clock in the hall marked the passage of another hour. Holmes had not moved from his armchair, his eyes fixed upon the dancing embers in the grate. Yet Watson knew the stillness was merely superficial. The mind that had just dismantled a syndicate and reconstructed a murder from chemical residue and staged hysteria was already cataloguing the ambient data of the room. Presently Holmes reached for his pipe, tapping the bowl against the heel of his boot before striking a match. "The postman has been replaced, Watson," he remarked, without looking up, his voice carrying its usual dry precision. "The new man walks with a pronounced stiffness in his right knee, likely from an old cavalry wound. He carries the letters in a leather satchel rather than a canvas one, and he has developed a habit of pausing precisely 3 seconds at our doorstep before ascending the stairs. Either he fears Mrs. Hudson's temper, or he is rehearsing his manner for a promotion to the sorting office. The former is more probable, given the slight smudge of ink on his left cuff. He signs for parcels with unnecessary flourish." Watson smiled, the familiar rhythm of his companion's observation settling over him like a well-worn coat. It was a trivial deduction, I entirely disconnected from the gravity of the day's events, yet it served as a quiet reminder of the machinery that never truly rested behind Holmes's impassive features. "You see the world as a continuous manuscript," Watson said, closing his own notebook and resting his hands upon its cover. "While the rest of London sees only the surface, you read the margins." Finch believed he had written a perfect tragedy, yet he left his fingerprints on every page. Holmes drew deeply on his pipe, the amber glow illuminating the sharp planes of his face. "Perfection is a myth invented by those who fear the variables of human error." Finch understood thermal expansion and chemical viscosity, but he neglected the most fundamental law of nature: friction. The drag of a coat hem, the hesitation of a frightened clerk, each of the residual damp in the dockyard air. These were not oversights. They were inevitabilities. When a man attempts to force reality into a predetermined shape, the seams will always tear. My only contribution was to stand in the right place and watch them unravel. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Do not mistake my methods for brilliance, Watson. I merely refuse to accept the convenient lie. The police see a closed door and imagine a locked room. I see a closed door and ask who held the key, why they turned it, and what they hoped to conceal in the silence that followed." Watson felt the familiar swell of admiration that had accompanied every case he had chronicled. There was no arrogance in Holmes's tone, only the quiet certainty of a man who had long since surrendered to the discipline of observation. He watched his companion rise and cross to the window, drawing back the heavy velvet curtain to peer into the darkening street. The fog had returned, a pale veil drifting past the gas lamps, muffling the distant clatter of evening traffic and the calls of newspaper boys. "London will continue to spin its webs," Holmes murmured, his breath fogging the glass. "Men will always seek to bend time, to manufacture certainty, to hide their greed behind the curtain of the impossible. But the calendar cannot be forged, and cause will always beget effect. We do not chase phantoms, Watson. We merely dust the mirrors." He turned back to the room, his demeanour shifting once more from philosopher to practitioner. He crossed to the chemistry bench, selecting a clean retort and a vial of crystalline salt with the focused grace of a musician tuning an instrument. The Finch ledger will occupy the courts for months. Parliament will debate, the press will sensationalize, and the public will eventually turn its attention to the next scandal. As for us, the attic must be cleared. He poured a measured quantity of water into the retort, watching the crystals dissolve with quiet fascination. "I have received a note from the British Museum regarding a discrepancy in the cataloguing of Mesopotamian clay tablets. The curator insists the cuneiform inscriptions contradict established trade routes. It is a matter of linguistics, not criminality, yet it promises a most agreeable diversion." Watson rose, buttoning his coat as the fire's warmth surrendered to the evening chill. And he knew the reprieve would be brief. The city outside would inevitably yield another puzzle, another locked door, another mind willing to test the boundaries of reason. But for now the work was done. The witness was at peace, the syndicate was dismantled, and the truth had been restored to its proper sequence. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the figure already bent over the laboratory bench, the soft hiss of the gas burner and the rhythmic tap of Holmes's pen against a fresh sheet of paper, marking the quiet beginning of a new inquiry. London's secrets would wait, but Holmes's mind never did. And as Watson descended the stairs into the foggy night, he carried with him the enduring certainty that so long as reason endured, the darkness would never truly hold sway. The following morning dawned crisp and clear. To the November fog, burned away by a pale winter sun that cast sharp, geometric shadows across Baker Street, I returned to the sitting room to find Holmes already at the low table, the Finch ledger open before him alongside a stack of official correspondence, his pen moving with swift, economical strokes as he drafted a final memorandum for Lestrade. The air was still heavy with the quiet aftermath of the previous night's revelations, but the study's atmosphere had shifted from contemplation to resolution. Holmes did not look up as I entered, merely sliding a sealed envelope toward the edge of the table. "For the Chronicle, Watson," he said. "The case requires its final notation before I can sign it to the filing cabinet. You will find that every apparent anomaly collapses into a single, unbroken chain of cause and effect." I took my seat, eye-opening the notebook to a fresh page as Holmes set down his pen and leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The title you have chosen for your manuscript," he began, his tone carrying the dry precision of a lecturer addressing a familiar pupil, "is misleading only in its suggestion of the supernatural. Miss Vance did not remember the future. She remembered a rehearsal." Finch understood that the human mind, when saturated with belladonna and digitalis, becomes remarkably susceptible to suggestion. He did not need her to witness a murder, he needed her to witness a script. The details she provided, the hissing gas, the spilled ink, the grandfather clock's chime, were not prophetic visions. They were stage directions delivered during a chemically induced trance. By feeding them to a hysterical woman and allowing her to deliver them to the police, he ensured the Yard would treat the crime as a supernatural certainty rather than a mechanical puzzle. The future, in this instance, was merely a carefully timed echo. He reached for a silver letter opener, turning it slowly in his hands. The true ingenuity lay not in the prophecy, but in the misdirection. Finch knew the thermal trigger would fail in the damp dockyard air. He built that failure into the design. When the wax seal hardened prematurely, he entered through the servants' passage, struck the victim himself, overturned the chair, jammed the clock, and planted the torn coat lining on Croft's garment. Every inconsistency you noted was deliberate. The hissing gas was meant to imply a draft. The shouted word was meant to imply passion. The stopped clock was meant to imply suddenness. Yet all three were adjustments made by a man trying to salvage a failing mechanism while preserving a manufactured narrative. He believed the police would accept the spectacle and abandon the search for the architect. He was correct, until you and I arrived. I listened as the fire crackled, the final pieces locking into place with the quiet satisfaction of a well-turned cipher. The syndicate's accounts had already been seized, the railway contract suspended pending parliamentary inquiry, and Finch's associates had scattered to the continent, their ledgers yielding far more readily to official subpoenas than to midnight confrontations. Miss Vance, freed from the chemical haze, had begun to write letters of her own again, her mind clearing with the steady rhythm of recovery. The city would process the scandal, the courts would dispense their verdict, and the newspapers would print their sensational headlines. But for us, the resolution carried a different weight. It was not a triumph of intuition over chance, but a quiet affirmation that every deception, no matter how elegantly constructed, leaves a trail of friction in the machinery of reality. Holmes rose, crossing to the window, as a distant carriage clattered past, its wheels echoing against the damp pavement. "Men will always attempt to bend time to their will, Watson," he murmured, his reflection sharp against the glass. "They will forge memories, halt clocks, and engineer locked rooms to conceal their guilt. Yet chronology is a law, not a suggestion. Cause precedes effect. Friction leaves a mark, and truth, however heavily buried, will always surface when the weight of logic is applied." He turned back to the room, his expression already shifting toward the mundane. "The Meridian affair is concluded, the ledger is archived, and the British Museum's cuneiform discrepancy awaits a rather more agreeable examination. I suggest you prepare your coat. The curator insists the tablets arrived in crates stamped with a peculiar wax seal, and I find myself suddenly intrigued by the trade routes of ancient Mesopotamia. I smiled, closing my notebook as the morning light warmed the worn Persian rug. The mystery had been dismantled, the illusion stripped away, yet the admiration I felt for my companion's mind remained undiminished. He had not solved a puzzle of the supernatural, he had simply refused to let the world pretend that one existed. As I stepped out into the crisp November air, the city's distant hum wrapping around me like a familiar overcoat, I knew the story would endure. Not as a tale of ghosts or prophecies, but as a quiet reminder that in a world determined to obscure the truth, there will always be those who insist on reading the margins, and so long as Baker Street stood, the game would never truly end.